Today we're looking at Classicism Part 2 of 2. This follows on from the information that we looked at last week. Okay, I would advise you to have a look again at the very first video because obviously this follows on from that, so it kind of makes some sense. So you should really be looking at these videos together, really, because together they make sense. Right, last week we looked at this in great depth. We looked at context, didn't we? In order to illustrate this very simple point that context informs theory, and likewise theory is informed by context. Okay? The way that we did this was that I set out our timeline. Okay, we're going to go back to that again in a moment just to identify some of the key points. So this is really what we're going to be doing this particular week. And last week we looked at this. This week we're going to be looking at that. And I'm going to be showing you how one informs the other. Okay, how theory is informed by the context. We're going to do some other things today then. So just note them down over here so you've got a kind of an idea where the lecture's going. Firstly, I'm going to identify some of the key points that we looked at in terms of context. Secondly, we're going to draw those linkages. Okay, so we're going to be looking at what classicism actually says. Okay, so what the key tenets of classicism are. Okay, and we'll see how classicism is informed by this context. The other thing that I want to do today is I want to look at the policy that flows from classicism. Okay, so what rule changes it recommends, okay, what adjustments it calls for in terms of how the criminal justice system is actually run, administered, and so on. Okay, so that's pretty much where we're going. Okay, now there's one other thing that I want you to kind of have an eye on. Okay, if we get time, we'll look at this towards the end. But I want you to be considering the phases of criminal justice, because really, when we look at our timeline, here we go, here's our timeline, we can see that there's a fundamental shift, okay, in deviancy control, okay, deviancy control. And I want you to try to be aware and be clear about the key aspects of that change in deviancy control. It really comes back to this again, so it's the context, okay? So that's a broad outline of where we're going today then, okay, so you know what we're going to be doing. Right, let's go back then to the first point, the context then. We made some really important observations last week. I'll give you now the opportunity to tell me what you think the key points were from last week in terms of the context. What was happening, what was important about this period then? What were the key drivers? Do you remember we said, didn't we, that in order to understand theory then, theory is informed by the context, which means that theory is situated, okay? It then comes from a context, okay? So these are the socio-economic, political, and cultural drivers, okay? So theory is driven by this context then. So what were the key drivers then, socio-economic, political drivers? Any thoughts? Brilliant. Okay. The emergence of the bourgeoisie. We won't use the term bourgeoisie because that's a term that we associate with kind of critical Marxist approaches. We'll use the term middle class. Okay, that's the term that we'll use. For the want of a better word, we'll call this the mercantile class as well. Right. Brilliant. Okay. So, just a quick overview then. What you're saying is that in pre-modernity, this is pre-modernity, isn't it? This is modernity. In pre-modernity, then, classes were very rigid, weren't they? So there wasn't a great deal of movement between them. So you had the monarch, you had the aristocracy, and then you had the rest of us, the serfs. Okay, no movement between them. And we noted then that as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution, we begin to see the emergence of a new class, a mercantile class. So again, you've still got your aristocracy, you've got your monarchy, you've got your aristocracy. But here then, you've got the emergence of a new class. Okay, this new class, the mercantile class then. Right, what was the importance of the emergence of this mercantile class then? Because it's really important to understanding classicism, isn't it? There was a shift from feudalism to capitalism, you're absolutely right, okay. Why were the middle classes important in understanding the emergence of classicism? What were the middle classes in particular calling for? They wanted answers. What type? Yes. So they were raising questions, weren't they? What type of questions were they raising then? What kind of answers were they wanting? What was their primary concern? To get more rights. Brilliant. Right. They were calling, the middle classes were calling for greater rights, weren't they? Greater rights to trade, greater social rights, greater economic rights, greater political rights, just more rights. Right. Okay, so then, they're calling for greater rights to trade, greater rights to, so they're calling for greater rights. Okay, so, whilst all this is happening then, there was the Enlightenment. Okay, the Enlightenment is something that operates on the backdrop of classicism. What was the Enlightenment about? What was the Enlightenment? They wanted to social structures. Yes, they did want to rebuild. What's the other word for rebuild then, rather than rebuild? What was the Enlightenment project about?
Was it like the age of reason where it moved from religion?
Good, right, you're saying all the right things. So it was the age of reason. I'll explain what that means in a moment. What was the Enlightenment project? It wanted to rebuild. Well, let me tell you what the Enlightenment project was. The Enlightenment project was about three things. Okay? The first thing that the Enlightenment project was about was reform. Okay, rebuild if you like, yeah, to use your term. The second thing that the Enlightenment project was about was reform. The third thing that the Enlightenment project was about was reform. Reform, reform, reform. That was the Enlightenment project then, okay? It wanted to reform. It wanted to reform these old ways of dealing with criminal justice, these old ways of dealing with disputes. And it wanted to bring about a much more enlightened approach, okay? A much more enlightened approach based upon this, reason, okay? So this period here, is the age of reason. Here, in pre-modernity, if a volcano erupts, what's the explanation that's given? How do we explain it? God, that's one word. What do you mean? God did it. God's hungry. God's got the Angry, yes. Okay, so God's angry. Okay, so God is expressing his displeasure by making a volcano erupt. So explanations seem to be, or were, grounded in superstition, or, if you like, religion. Okay. Now, the Enlightenment project was about questioning these old structures. Okay. It was about questioning these old arrangements. Now, we said last week, didn't we, that religion had a very central role to play in society. Okay, so people would regularly go to church, and people would listen to. Sorry about the banging. It seems to be constant distractions. Yeah. So the explanations tended to be based around superstition. Something happened as a result of the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment that changed those belief structures. What was the belief structures that begin to emerge as a consequence of the Enlightenment there? People begin to explain things not in terms of superstition, but now the volcano erupts. Science and reason. Yes. Right. So rationality, reason begins to hold sway. People begin to ask questions and they want answers. It's about reform, reform, reform. This old system then of punishment, do you remember we said it was capital and corporal in nature? Okay, so it was primarily focused upon the body. That was the focus of punishment then. So you would literally, the state would literally inflict pain upon the body. Hopefully the banging will stop. Sorry. Capital and corporal forms of punishment that were aimed at the body. These were seen particularly by the middle classes, the new emerging middle classes, as being what then? What was their objection to these old forms of punishment? They were seen as being inefficient, brilliant, inefficient. They were seen as being brilliant, excellent, barbaric. Inefficient, barbaric. Unsystematic. I like that. Okay, I can't spell that. Unsystematic. Unsystematic. What else? What was it? Brutal. We've already got brutal. Barbaric, brutal. Yeah. Anything else? Unproportionate. You're making up words, aren't you? I do that all the time. Disproportionate. There you go. Disproportionate.
Same thing.
They were seen to be.
No, nothing.
They were seen to be arbitrary. What else?
What does that mean?
Arbitrary, not really based on any kind of logic. So the example I gave last week is that you might be given, lashes for stealing, the same as you might be given lashes for murder, for example. It was arbitrary. There was no reason. There didn't seem to be any proportionality, really. Okay, so it flows on from that. So this old system then is seen as being arbitrary, inefficient, barbaric, unsystematic, and disproportionate. But really, the main thing that it was seen as being was this, which is unsuccessful. Okay, it was seen as being inefficient, basically. It was seen as being really a waste of time. It would appear, people were looking around them and it would appear as though crime was becoming ubiquitous. Crime was becoming a real problem. And do you remember we said that in pre-modernity you've got these small, homogenous communities that eventually turn into these big metropolises. The city becomes a scary place then. So it would seem as though crime is on the increase. So this old system is seen as being inefficient. It's seen as not dealing with the problems that are presented by the onset of modernity. So the Enlightenment thinkers started to call for reform, okay? A much more enlightened way of dealing with crime. Now, they did this in a very important way. They said, that what was needed was a system that was based more upon reason, but in particular, rationality. They wanted a reasoned, rational system of dealing with those that broke the law. Okay? So reform, reform, reform. This was all about change. It was about improvement. It was about progress, progress, progress. Okay? That's the whole Enlightenment project. So then, what did they say then? Let's move on to this then, Classicism. What they actually said then, the classicists, people like Beccaria and Bentham. They said that in order to bring about reform, 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 we needed to completely restructure the criminal justice system. And this is what they said. They said that to start with, we need to understand the nature of human action. Okay, so here then we're looking at the key tenets of classicism. Right, now this is a really important point. I'm just going to pause here to explain what I mean by this. All theories that we look at over the next few weeks make assumptions. Okay, they're all embedded in assumptions. We said in the seminars, didn't we, last week, that theory is basically a cluster of ideas based upon assumptions. So all theories then make assumptions. Our task, your task, is to reveal what those assumptions are and to evaluate them. Some assumptions will be more persuasive than others. Okay, so all theories then make these assumptions. Now, in order to evaluate this, then you need to unpick these assumptions. You need to ask yourself whether what the theory says is coherent and whether it's consistent. So let's look at some assumptions that they make then. Okay, now there's lots of them, and I'm only going to pick out 3 of them. Okay, if you look at the Jock Young article, the Thinking Seriously About Crime article that I've put up on Blackboard, you'll see that there are many, many more assumptions they make. But I'm just going to pick out some of the key ones, okay? But you need to be aware that there are more. The driving force for this approach then is that the classicists are humanitarianistic in approach. It's a humanitarianistic approach. Okay, I'll explain what that means then. The theory is humanitarianistic in nature because their starting point is to consider the old system, the old way of administering justice as being inefficient. Okay? So they wanted to have a much more enlightened, a much more civilized form of dealing with law breaking. Okay? So it's humanitarian in drive, in terms of its direction. The first assumption that they make about the nature of human action is freedom. They say that we are all free. We are all free. We are all free-willed, and consequently, we're able to make choices. Okay, this is the starting point then. Remember that what we're doing here is we're looking at some of the explanations that have been given for the causes of crime. Some of you are already making the connections, right? So if we're all free, we're able to make choices. If we're able to make choices, some people make bad choices, criminal choices. So we're all endowed with the ability to reason, okay? We all have a subjective intent or responsibility, okay? So we're all endowed with the ability to make choices. The second assumption that they make is this. Rationality. That is then, they say that we all behave in a rational manner. So we're free to make choices and we're free to behave in a rational manner. We're able to make reasoned, rational choices. The third assumption they make, I say there are more, but these are just the ones we're looking at, is manipulability. Manipulability. By this, they mean one thing, and this is really important. I'm going to use a different colour for this. This is really important. If we are able to be manipulated, it means then that we are able to be controlled, and particularly that crime can be controlled. Okay? So this is the starting point then. It's humanitarian approach, okay? But they make a number of assumptions. Firstly, that we're free, we're able to make choices, that we are endowed with the ability to reason. Okay, so we make these choices on the basis of reason, but more importantly, we are capable of being manipulated, which basically means then that we are able to be controlled through manipulation. Okay, so at the moment you're looking at that and you're thinking, well, yeah, that seems pretty straightforward. But let me try to explain how this translates into policy. Okay, so we're moving on to the third thing here. How does this then translate into real policy? Well, let's think about this then. Okay, so we're all free. We're all free to make choices. So let's have a look. Right, to steal your phone? Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. You just gave it to me. Is this better than my one? I don't think it is, but I'll take it anyway. Okay, so the phone. Do you remember in the first week I took somebody's phone and we explained that this, if I intend to take it without giving it back, that could amount to what we call a crime. Yeah, it could amount to a violation of Section 1 of the Theft Act. Okay, and we said that there are certain elements: the dishonest appropriation of goods belonging to another with the intention to permanently deprive. Okay, so if those elements there, if the actus reus is there and the mens rea is there, that is a crime. Okay, well, let's look at this in a different way. Let's look at this from a classicist perspective. Okay, so we have an action. Okay, so according to classicists, then I am free, aren't I? Okay, I am free to make choices. Right, so not only am I free to make choices, but my choices are based upon reason, or for want of another word, rationality. Okay, so my action then. So the action here then is taking this camera. Okay, this phone, this camera phone. So there's the phone. Right, so I've taken it. Okay, so the action is then taking of the phone. Now I have a choice. What is my choice? I have two choices here then. I have the action to take the phone or not to take the phone. Okay, I'm deciding that to exercise this choice, okay, I will take this phone. Okay, so this is the option I'm going to take. Now, underpinned by this choice, according to classicists, is reason and rationality. Okay, now, me, according to the classicists, is a free-willed, rational person who guides their behaviour according to reason and rationality. Am I going to put this phone in my pocket and walk out of the class with the phone? No, I'm not, am I? Okay, why am I not going to do that? He says walking around with the camera and the phone in the back pocket. Why am I not going to do that? No, not that I should know better, but according to classicists, why am I not going to do that? Right, okay, so I'm weighing up the choices, aren't I? Okay, so what are the choices? The choices are this action. So on this hand, I've got this phone. Okay, well, is it an expensive phone? Sorry? Kind of, right, so, and I could do another one, so you can never have too many phones, can you? Right, so that's the potential pleasure that I'm going to obtain from this. What's the potential pain? She's going to report me to who? To the police, yeah, and? Am I going to get punished? Right, well, this is the point, isn't it? According to the classicists then, when we make choices, there's our action. When we make choices, our behaviour is based upon reason and rationality. Okay? They say, and this is another assumption that they make, that all our choices are based upon this, hedonism. Hedonism means that we value pleasure more than we value pain. So we want to increase our pleasure and decrease pain. Pleasure. We value pleasure and we want to avoid pain. That kind of, does that sort of intuitively, we can kind of, that seems as though it makes sense, doesn't it? It's important that we ask ourselves whether these theories are intuitively, whether they appeal to our intuition as well. So then, we value pleasure and we want to avoid pain. Okay? So what's the potential pleasure then? Well, the potential pleasure is, for me exercising this action, is that I don't have a white iPhone, so that's a potential pleasure. If I take this and not give it back, I've now got myself a nice white iPhone. What's the potential pain? Well, the potential pain is that you tell my boss, my boss tells me off and he disciplines me saying, Mark, I've told you before you can't go around stealing students' phones. Or you could go to the police, couldn't you? And the police would say you can't go around stealing people's phones, and I might get a criminal conviction if found guilty in a court of law. Okay, that's the potential pain. Me, as a free-willed, rational creature then, am I going to take this phone? No, I'm not. I'm going to give it back. Okay? Right, so what does that tell us about criminality then? It means, go on, you said it. It's a choice. Criminality is a choice. What type of choice is it? It's an irrational choice, isn't it? So criminality then is simply a collection of irrational choices. No reasoned rational person would commit crime knowing what the consequences were. So we are guided by pleasure and we want to avoid pain. Those people that commit crime then do so by making a free-willed rational choice. They simply choose to commit crime based upon poor reason or poor rationality. They're not thinking it through. Okay? So, how does this then translate into real policy, into the changes that they were calling for? Remember, they were asking for three things, weren't they? Which was, what's the Enlightenment Project? They were calling for reform or progress, progress, progress. Not to write it out. Right, so progress, progress, progress. Right. So, in many ways then, their programme was one of reform. To reform these old practices with new, much more systematic practices. Okay, so let's look at some of the changes there. So here then, punishment was very much in pre-modernity, before classicism, punishment was very much focused upon the body. Okay, and I gave you an example last week, didn't I, of Michel Foucault, of being hung, drawn and quartered. Well, in the very same book, in the very first chapter, what Foucault does is he contrasts this being hung, drawn and quartered. Remember I draw the... being hung, drawn and quartered with another new kind of enlightened form of punishment, which was brought about as a consequence of classicism, which was this. Prison, their prison bars. Okay? Now, the focus of punishment was not to be on the body, but it was to be on the mind, okay? Because we are free-willed, rational creatures, so you need to reform the individual's mind, okay? You need to help them to be able to make reasoned, informed choices, okay? So put them in prisons, put them incarcerate them, and let them reflect upon their criminal behaviour. Let them reflect upon the bad choices that they made. Okay? So, what we get then is a shift from capital or corporal forms of punishment to what's called carceral forms of punishment. This is the birth of the prison. This is where we begin to see the birth of the prison. What Michel Foucault does is, in the first chapter of Discipline and Punish, he, as I said last week, he describes this scene, this horrific, brutal scene of Damien's, the would-be regicide, being hung, drawn and quartered. He goes on in that chapter to describe the routine of a French prison. And he says that the prison is highly routinized, okay? It's highly structured, so everyone gets up at the same time. Everyone eats at the same time. The body becomes regulated, okay? It becomes regulated. This is seen as a much more civilized, a much more enlightened, a much more progressive, a much more humane way of dealing with people who break the law. The focus of punishment shifts from the body to mind. Indeed, to reforming the mind. Remember, this was all based upon these very brutal forms of punishment then. In many ways, punishment during this period was based upon this notion. It's a Latin term called lex talionis. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It was very much based upon retribution. Okay, that's why it tends to be very harsh and punitive in nature. So this new enlightened way of dealing with prisoners then, this new enlightened way of dealing with crime, was based upon these classicist notions of reason and rationality. Okay? You change the individual's way of making choices, put them in prison and let them reflect upon their criminal behaviour. And in future, hopefully, it will deter them from making these criminal choices, these bad choices in the future. Okay? So that's one way in which the classicists tried to bring about this progress, this reform of criminal justice. They wanted to see a much more civilized form of punishment. So you move from focusing the body to focusing on the mind, okay? So you get the introduction of prisons. Now, Jeremy Bentham, who you've all heard of before, he devised of this kind of architectural conjuring trick in order to deal with people that broke the law. And it was what he called the panopticon. The panopticon, as I say, is this architectural conjuring trick. And we'll look at this in more detail when we look at the film in a couple of weeks' time, which I'm going to make available on Blackboard. So the prison was effectively kind of like a cylinder. So if you can imagine it's going up like this, okay? So you've got, in the middle, you've got this kind of central watchtower. So there's the central watchtower. And it has like these little slits, okay? So here are the kind of the cells coming off. So you've got cells around here. So there's a cell there, there's a cell there. Okay, so you've got this kind of central observation platform. So there'd be like little slits in the windows here, okay? Now, the guard, the prison guard, would be located in here. But at no time do the inmates know whether or not they're being looked at, okay? Whether they're being surveyed, whether they're being observed. Okay? So according to Bentham, what this would do is that it creates docile bodies. You kind of get control by uncertainty. So these cells are backlit. There's light flooding into the back of these cells. There are no gates or doors, and so you kind of got control through uncertainty. People didn't know what would happen if they were to actually leave their cell. Okay, and in many ways, you know, whilst this was never really put into practice, that loosely speaking, many of our prisons, particularly the Victorian ones, are based upon a loose structure. So you'll find that there's like a central area, and then the cells kind of come off from this central area. So there's like the cells here. So this was seen as being a much more humane, a much more enlightened way of dealing with those that break the law. There's more policy that comes from this as well, because as I said, their project was about progress, reform. We noted that one of their concerns, one of their classicist concerns, was this old barbaric system of punishment that was disproportionate. And they said, well, what we need is this. We need a tariff of pain. Remember we said that our actions, according to them, guided by pleasure, and we want to avoid pain. So they wanted to develop what's called a tariff of pain. So they literally tried to draw this up. So what you had was a crime, and then you had the punishment. Okay? And for each crime, there will be an appropriate punishment that accords to the actual seriousness of the crime. So you have crime here. So here you might have theft, and then say theft of anything below £100. I'm making these up, okay? Of 100, anything below £100 would mean, I don't know, 100 hours community service. Okay? Theft of over £200 might be. Theft of over £200 might be 200 hours of community service, and so on and so forth. And we're going to look at this in today's seminar when we look at the Carol and Rebecca scenario. Okay? So they developed what's called a tariff of pain, where you had crimes that were attached to specific penalties. This, according to them, would get rid of any problems in terms of disproportionality. The punishment must fit the crime. Okay? So, going back then, my action, taking the phone, okay, pleasure and pain. I didn't take that phone because I know what the consequences of my action are. It's very clear, it's very certain. I know, for example, that I would potentially get a fine for doing so. I won't go to prison, but I would get a fine. Okay? So when an individual acts, they must know that their behaviour has consequences. Okay? So the criminal justice system then needs to be clear. It needs to be certain, so that when somebody behaves, when somebody makes a choice, when somebody acts, they do so on the basis of enhancing their pleasure and avoiding pain. So if I knew, for example, that I could get away with stealing that phone, then I might be more inclined to make a reasoned choice to steal it. Okay, so you need to know then that punishment will flow and it will be certain. So, policy is flowing from this then. There are real changes, and we'll look at some of the problems with some of this policy. Okay, so far then you're sitting there and you're looking at this and you think, oh, this kind of makes sense then. Crime is a free-willed rational choice. I said to you that one of the really important things to remember is this notion of manipulability then, that crime can be controlled. This whole project, the Classicist project, was about this. Correctionalism. Crime is something that can and ought to be controlled. So for the first time then, we've explored our first framework, our first way of seeing, our first theory, which says that people who engage in criminality simply choose to do so. They make a collection of bad choices. Okay? So this approach is all about controlling crime. You control crime by having a clear system of justice. No reasoned person is going to commit a crime knowing that the consequences of their action will be bad, that they will be given a prison sentence or that punishment will follow. Why would somebody commit crime knowing that? Okay? So this is about correcting behaviour then. It's about correctionalism. It's all about the control of crime. And this is why I said to you in the very first week, this is why many of you wanted to understand, why many of you wanted to study criminology, because it is about the control of crime. Okay? You wanted to understand the causes of crime. I've told you, bad choices. And how we can control it, well, we have a very clear system of justice that makes sure that punishment follows the crime. Okay, so causes of crime, controlling crime. Okay, well this all sounds really good then, doesn't it? Or does it? What are the problems with this approach? Because so far it sounds wonderful. In a way, you're kind of right, because if he's saying that we're all free to make choices based upon reason, there are, according to the classicists then, some people that are sub-reason, if you like, okay? So people that don't have the full capacity to reason. So people who have mental illness, children, for example. Children don't fully have the ability to make choices, do they, or to exercise real reason. On this point, incidentally, the Crime and Disorder Act in 1998, one of the things that it did was abolish this. This is a Latin term. I'll explain what it means. There used to be what's called a rebuttable presumption of doli incapax. Rebuttable presumption of doli incapax. So, if a child between the ages of 10 and 14 committed a crime, the prosecution would need to show, this is before 1998, the prosecution needed to show that what the child did was, or that the child knew that their behaviour was wrong. Okay, and not only did they know that it was wrong, but they knew that the nature and the quality of their act was wrong. So you needed to show them, in essence, that the child had reason. Okay, now if it could be shown that the child had the capacity to form an intent, then that they would be prosecuted. Now this was abolished. This rebuttable presumption was abolished by the Crime and Disorder Act of 1998. What does that tell us about the way that we now see the culpability of children? What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that now we see children as being able to form an intent at a lot younger age, that children mature younger. But you're right, the classicists did say then that there were some who were unable to develop an intent, and therefore we shouldn't hold those criminally responsible. So that's why still today, children under the age of 10 are not held responsible for their actions at criminal law. Okay, it doesn't mean so they're not held responsible, but they're not held responsible at criminal law, which is different. And that really is something that harks back to these classicist notions of not being able to form an intent. We don't hold people criminally responsible if they're mentally insane, for example. Yeah, it means that we don't hold them responsible. We do. We don't hold them criminally responsible. And this is very much something that flows from classicism. It is in many ways some of the consequences of this. Okay, so there are the sub-reasons then. What are the other problems with this? Now, there should be something that really, particularly those of you that looked at the scenario today, there is something quite odd about this approach. What is that? It doesn't take out social inequality. You're absolutely right. At the heart of this whole project, we said, was about reform, reform, reform. Okay, really what the classicists were about, and this is a paradox, was about equality. They wanted to have greater equality, didn't they? They wanted to have greater rights to trade. They wanted to have greater equality. Now, what this brings us to is a paradox. Because at the same time as trying to actually pursue equality, what happens is considerable inequality. Those of you that looked at the Carol and Rebecca scenario today will have seen that there was just something so inequitous about that. There was something unfair about that scenario. Carol and Rebecca, very different people. One's very rich, one's very poor, yet they're both still, but they're being given the same punishment. So one of the problems with this is that on a formal level, the classicists are saying that we are all equal. Everyone should be treated alike. So we treat all criminals alike. So everyone who commits a particular crime will be given a particular punishment. That's proportionate. It's fair, isn't it? Because we want to get rid of all these arbitrary forms of punishment. We want a much more certain, a much more consistent form of punishment. Okay? Because this is what will actually reduce the crime problem as a consequence. So, on a formal level then, they're saying that we are all equal. Well, let's look in this room now. Okay? Are we all equal in this room? In certain ways. In what ways are we not equal then? So what I'm saying is, in what ways are we actually differentiated? In what ways are we different?
Class, gender,
Brilliant. Class, gender, age, ethnicity. Flows from class, I suppose, in many ways, isn't it? It's a manifestation of that. Right, there are others, but let's just focus on these then. Right, what they're saying then, they're saying that formally we are all equal. So we are all equal before the law, so we should all be given the same punishment for the same crime. Okay? But, oddly enough, you have this paradox. It's what we call the classicist contradiction. The classicist contradiction is that whilst they say that formally we are all equal, substantively we are not all equal. There are differences, so we are different in terms of age, gender, class, ethnicity. So this is the paradox, and whilst they had this great project of treating everyone the same, we're not all the same, are we? Okay? And maybe it's those differences, this is the key point, maybe it's those differences that are important to understand why people commit criminality, not the fact that it's just a reasoned choice. Look at it this way. If you look at the prison population, if that's the entire prison population, and we look at it in terms of gender, okay, so male, female, what's the gender divide then? Well, when we look at the prison population, we see that the vast majority of criminals are male, and a very small section are female. What does that tell us about what the classicists say? What does the classicist explanation be? Well, it kind of implies that somehow women are less likely to make these irrational criminal decisions. Men are more likely to make these rational decisions. If we look at the same thing in terms of class, well, again, so many pens, I don't know what I'm doing. If you look at it in terms of class, we can see that, again, the vast majority of people in prisons are from working class backgrounds, from poor backgrounds. When we look at it in terms of age, okay, increasingly this is changing, but you tend to find that the vast majority of of offenders are young. In terms of ethnicity, disproportionately young African Caribbean men are disproportionately represented within the criminal justice system. So what does that tell us then about our explanations for the causes of crime then? Well, perhaps it's this that's more important to understand rather than just choices. Maybe it's ethnicity, it's class, it's gender. These are the things that are really the driving forces behind criminality, not just simply a question of making a free will, rational, bad choice. So, we've come a long way then. What we've seen then is that these ideas, that classicism is situated. Now, we could have had this lecture in probably 5 minutes. I could have said to you, the classicists make a number of assumptions about the nature of human action. One of them is that we're free. Okay. Secondly, that we have choices, and thirdly, we can be manipulated. Okay. Now, you would have understood that, and you would have gone away, and that would have been fine. You would have probably been happy with that. But what's important to remember is that these just don't happen in a vacuum. These assumptions they make about human action are situated, and they come from the context, don't they? Understand the context, and it tells you more about the theory. Okay, so hopefully now you can see then the importance of theory. Now this is the starting point then. This is where we start in terms of the journey, in terms of the narrative, in terms of the whole story. We start off with classicism. Being no doubt, we come back to this again towards the end of the module. Some of these ideas are kind of rehashed. We call it neo-classicism. New classicism. So some of these ideas are still very much with us, but we begin to see then that these ideas are problematic, okay, because there is this real problem with the classicist contradiction that they think that we're all equal, in actual fact we're not, and then that creates its own inequities, that creates its own problems, its own injustices, which concern us. Okay, so that's really what we're going to, that's pretty much classicism now. We've had 2 weeks on that. Next week we're going to move on in terms of the story, and we're going to look at what's called positivism. There are different forms of positivism which I'll outline to you next week, but mainly what we're going to look at next week is, again, the context. We're going to look at the positivistic context. What is positivism? And we'll see that in many ways it kind of contrasts with this, but it still has the same driving force as well. And your job is to be able to identify what the assumptions are and what the nuances are between these different approaches. Okay, does anybody have any questions? Good, okay, thank you.